James, a very good evening to you and thanks for your time. And as we see, children of today facing many more challenges than we did more than 30 years ago. What are the main ones that are bothering you?
Yeah, I think the main ones are absolutely climate change. Climate crisis is happening now. There was always a sense that this was something that was coming, but it has arrived, and that both here on the continent, very much so, but essentially no one is immune to that. Conflict, unfortunately today there are more children in countries that are enduring conflict or some sort of natural emergency than at any time in the last 30 years. It's important to know this 30 years is important. The reason the Executive Director of Unicef wrote this letter is because we are celebrating 30 years after the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which really was a groundbreaking convention that almost every single country signed on to bring child rights into the fore of families and governments. And there's been incredible progress. But yes, when you look at the climate crisis, when you look at migration, when you look at the jobs crisis on the continent, there are really big issues facing young people. Young people need to be aware of them, which is what we're doing now, but governments and private sector need to be taking a leading role in acting about them.
Bring it home for us, James. I mean, just give us exactly how this is affecting our children, how is it impacting our children. I mean, the issues of conflict, I think we know so far just how that affects children, especially here in Africa. We've seen on the continent here. Mental illness, we've had various discussions about this. But tell us about the climate crisis and the online misinformation. I'm particularly interested in that and what that's doing to our children.
Yes, Rebecca, well, the first on climate crisis, this really is the first time in history that we'll have an entire global generation who will suffer from an environment which is being degraded. Now, what does that really look like in Africa? What it looks like is that we will start to see, and we're starting to see already, an increase in things like cholera, malaria, meningitis. These kind of things will increase on the continent, and 90% of the people they affect are children under the age of 5. At the same time, we're going to see real problems around grain production, just food production. A couple of years ago, Southern Africa particularly endured the worst El Nino drought for 50 years. This year, in the next 12 months, we're seeing bigger problems when it comes to food production. So the impacts of climate when it comes to disease, when it comes to food production, when it comes to more droughts, more cyclones like we just saw in Mozambique, unfortunately these are becoming very real. Now, there's good news. We know that governments and the private sector need to hold hand and reduce fossil fuels and increase renewables, and there's things that everyday citizens can do. But it really is an alarm bell to say that this is no longer about what might happen tomorrow. This is absolutely happening now, and we have an obligation to inform our younger citizens, but also empower them to be able to do something about this.
And the online misinformation, I mean, just to what extent is that, holding our children back or impacting them?
Yeah, it's a really worrying area. Now, again, across Eastern and Southern Africa, it varies because, of course, digital penetration varies as well. But basically, more and more young people are accessing the internet every single day, and many of them in this part of the world, like many other parts, are extremely too trusting of where they get their news sources from. We're seeing studies around the world showing that many children are being duped in terms of the information they receive, and this can mean, that they are duped in terms of giving money away, giving their own data away, making themselves prone to, be abused, sexually abused, or grooming. This online misinformation can be so vast that in other parts of the world, the United States or Brazil, we've seen the democratic process undermined because of misinformation. In this part of the world, we see things like vaccinations, which are just bread and butter saving lives. We see misinformation come around vaccinations, and suddenly vaccination rates can drop 10 or 20%. So these social media companies that have got such a foothold, so embedded in the continent, and we know they can do good. We know young people can become activists, can do great things around music. But at the same time, social media companies can also bring out the worst of human traits. So there is a responsibility from those social media companies to ensure young people know what real information is, can understand what misinformation is, and the same with parents and teachers. It's really important as more and more people start to look online for their news sources.
All right, well, it certainly seems like we are racing against time to protect our children from these crises. Thank you very much, UNICEF's James Elder there joining us via Skype.